Welcome to the 6th webinar of the 2020-2021 EPRC seminar program. My name is Liliana Fonseca, and I'm a research assistant at the EPRC. In normal circumstances, these webinars would actually be seminars, would take place face-to-face at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. And we look forward to doing that again in the future. Nonetheless, we are delighted to be able to welcome you all from a bit all over Europe, I guess, maybe the world, in this webinar today, and hopefully for future webinars as well. Today we have a presentation by Dr. Maria Salomaa on characterizing universities' role in the implementation of structural funds operational programs. And just before I introduce our speaker, I would like to inform you that this meeting is being recorded, which means that you and your colleagues have the opportunity to follow the meeting at a later stage. And the recording will then be made available on our YouTube channel and shared with you by email. We would also encourage you to use Twitter to share your thoughts on the webinar, just so we have a bit more visibility on this topic. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the protocol for Zoom meetings by now. So keep your microphone on mute if you're not speaking. Use the blue hand with the raise hand function on Zoom if you would like to make an intervention, or feel free to use the chat function as well to send questions or comments, since after the presentation we'll have a Q&A. Okay, so I will present Maria. Maria Salomaa is a visiting research fellow at the University of Lincoln in the United Kingdom, and she currently works as an RDI specialist at the Tampere University of Applied Sciences in Finland. She holds a PhD in management from Lincoln International Business School, and MA degrees in higher education studies and theater and drama research from the University of Tampere in Finland. Her research interests are related to the university third mission, regional development, and RDI policies and funding instruments on both national and EU level. And so now I will stop sharing my screen, and I think you can go on ahead, Maria. I'll give the floor to you.
Okay, thank you, Liliana, for the invitation. Happy to be here. And like Liliana mentioned, I'm going to do a big presentation. I'm trying to summarize my whole PhD thesis in 30 minutes. So that's going to be one big task. So let's see if I can share the presentation. I've been practicing this, like I said, since March when we started remote working, but it doesn't always work out so well. Can you see my screen? Very good. I see nodding heads. Yes. So then I guess I can start the slideshow. Can I move this? Perfect. Okay, very good. So thank you for inviting me, and I'm very happy to talk more about the characterization of universities' role in the implementation of structural funds operational programs. And like I said, this is my PhD study in a nutshell, and I just defended my thesis in September, so I should still remember what it's about. I think I promised to talk about 4 case studies, but given the time limitation, I'm going to concentrate on 3 European case universities in this presentation. So to start with, this will be the key findings from the whole PhD thesis, and it was entitled University Third Mission in Rural Regions, and it was a comparative analysis on university engagement through the structural funds programs in the UK, Finland, and Portugal. And Liliana did a great job presenting who I am. So I don't need to go through my degrees and working history, but I just want to emphasize that the reason I've been so intrigued and fascinated by the structural funds and how universities are involved is that I got dragged in when I first graduated in 2008. And then I started working with structural funds and other funding instruments too, and I'm still doing that. So about 13 years I've been working with different funding schemes within the university context. And in the previous years, especially with structural funds, which is not always very straightforward, but something quite the opposite. A quick overview of the presentation. First, I'm going to talk about the background of the research project. Then I'm going to move on to research questions, methods, data, then present the flow of analysis, few words about the key concepts and the selected frameworks. But I would like to concentrate more on the key findings and the actual key result of the whole study, which is a typology of university-led structural funds projects, first of a kind. I would like to say I've never seen anything like that before, but feel free to enlighten me if you have heard of similar studies. And then maybe if we have time, I would like to give you recommendations and maybe few tips for future research, which hopefully I'm doing myself too. So as a very brief background, we all know that there are very high expectations towards university engagement, and universities are expected to facilitate entrepreneurship and technology transfer. And there's been a lot of literature about the third mission within the past 20 years. And this is obviously something that we also see on the policy level. EU policies urge universities to commercialize research, take a more active role in contributing to economic and regional development, especially in this program period, because the dominance of the smart specialization approach kind of bind universities more into risk-free formulation and also implementation. So this is how we come to structural funds. What's happening here? Right. So then national policies, obviously, they do have a major role in creating the context and conditions that enable universities to engage with their on the regional level and national level. And they also, which is very important, they define conditions for funding for these engagement activities. And that can be problematic. So a few words about structural funds. So as we all know, the cohesion policy transformed into national structural funds operational programs. They are one of the key instruments to support local level innovation, often through collaborative initiatives between different stakeholders, including higher education institutions, businesses, and other regional actors. However, previous studies have recognized that it is quite hard to actually assess the impact of the structural funds projects to economic growth. And it's also been mentioned that there are somewhat insufficient territorial approaches that are tailored successfully to different areas, especially, or for example, for rural regions, which were my focus in this study. More about structural funds. So what do we know about regional reports and previous studies and reports is that the structural funds can be important in creating the foundations of regional innovation systems, and they also can reinforce universities' regional engagement. They can be beneficial and contribute to RDI activities. But so far, the studies have not taken into account a single beneficiary's point of view, which kind of motivated me to look why universities should engage with these funding schemes. We also know that from previous studies that operational level evaluations could be beneficial for national and subnational policy formulation processes, and also even project level studies would be useful in gaining more knowledge on successful delivery mechanisms and what kind of policies support that. I guess I've mentioned it already, but we don't really know much about what universities have to do with structural funds. So I kind of felt that, oh, I'm exploring the unknown. How exciting. So when I started this study about 3 years back, obviously I knew that there is a lot of research about universities' role in regional development. So I looked into the key concepts of engaged university, third mission, entrepreneurial university. It was also obvious that universities and smart specialization approach are more or less bound together. So policy processes and instruments, they really matter in the way that universities can involve with structural funds projects. Then finally, I looked at the expectations towards the universities, especially in more remote areas. So there can be different demands, requirements, expectations towards the universities in these rural regions. So what's the reality, and can the university respond to these needs? And shuffling this all up together, and I ended up with a research question, which was how entrepreneurial universities manage and deliver regional engagement activities through structural funded projects. It was quite clear from the beginning that one size really does not fit all when it comes to universities' regional engagement. And then again, the structural funds programs may not give a lot of freedom for universities, but if they are able to deliver the third mission, in which we will talk in a minute, it's quite restricted. But then again, universities are expected to have a societal impact. So there are a lot of big concept and a lot of question marks to start with. So this is basically the flow of analysis of my whole thesis. I'm going to skip phase 1 in this presentation, which was about the impact of the rural context to the third mission. And we're going to focus on phase 2, which was about universities' engagement with structural funds projects. And I try to identify what kind of factors affect the institutional and individual academics' motivation to engage with the structural funds schemes, what kind of partnerships there are, and what kind of outcomes there could be or are expected from university-led structural funds projects. And also based on the results from the phase 2, we can have a look at phase 3, the final phase of my study, which was about creating a typology of university-led structural funds projects. So what kind of different types of projects there are, and how they could be aligned with the third mission, and what kind of challenges there might be, and what are the best practices, and some policy recommendations to end with. Okay, and here's the research outline. Like I said, I'm going to concentrate on 3 case studies today, one from Finland, one from the UK, and one from Portugal. So these all are, let's say, atypical cases in the sense that they are quite new universities, and they are located in somewhat rural setting, and they all have very strong regional focus since they were established. And they also are members of the European Consortium of Innovative Universities, except for Lincoln. So University of Lincoln, University of Aveiro, and University Consortium of Pori, which is a network of higher education institutions. I'm going to talk a little bit about each case study later on. So in 3 years, I managed to conduct 96 research interviews covering more than 40 structural funds projects. I talked with universities management, research and enterprise personnel, and of course academics and other professional staff members who actually dealt with the implementation of the structural funds projects. So it's very good that these days there's a lot of information available online about the funded structural funds project. So that's how I detected the informants, and then of course snowballing from there on. I also looked at the national structural funds operational programs, databases, higher education policies, regional development plans, institutional strategies, and so on. And because the data set was quite big, I used NVivo software when I did the coding, and it was also great for data storage. So I think I'm going to do that again. So the whole idea was to do a thick description of each case study and then just compare the results. I said I'm going to talk a little bit about the key concepts. And like I mentioned, there's a lot of research about the third mission university engagement, or however we call it. But I found these two papers to be quite useful in trying to identify what kind of different dimensions there are when we talk about the third mission. Because it was obvious that in this study, it has to be something beyond codified knowledge transfer. So this is not perfect, but it's one way to see the different dimensions, different economic and societal dimensions related to the third mission, which in a sense are all kind of some sort of even knowledge or human capital transfer to the society. So on the economic side, it can be offering highly skilled workforce, or the codified knowledge, which is kind of the traditional way of talking about this, or supporting entrepreneurship, spin-off, so on, or co-production, knowledge co-production with industry and business partners. On the societal side, it's a bit more vague. There can be contracts with public bodies, more general participation in policy-making processes, or involvement in social and cultural life, which is of course more difficult to measure or even describe. Or it can be related to public and increasing public understanding of science. But this is the framework I used for trying to identify what kind of dimensions of the third mission there can be in the university-led structural funds projects. So going to the structural funds projects, the favorite part. Even though there's not much literature to work on, there's something. And I was able to identify quite easily many challenges related to structural funds projects. So I'm going to run through those next. And the first challenge related to university-led structural funds project was collaboration. So based on previous reports and research, it was quite clear that these funding schemes can create non-desirable competition, meaning that instead of collaborative initiatives, regional actors just compete for the funds. And there can be lack of regional coordination. And it was also quite clear in some of my cases and also in my previous working life. I remember one time I talked with a funding authority from northern part of Finland, and he said that somehow they managed to fund basically the same project 6 times, and it was targeted to immigrants. And it can be very confusing if there are many similar projects running within the same area. And then the target groups, they get very confused when there are different actors offering the same training or same consultancy or same whatever. So there's room for improvement when it comes to coordination. This is more a problem related to remote regions, peripheral regions, or in this case, rural regions. So lack of business partners can be real tricky. For example, when I looked at Lincoln, it was quite obvious that the both academics and the regional authorities, they struggled to reach potential partners, even though there would have been many businesses who would have benefited a lot from, for example, innovation vouchers or consultancy provided by the university. It was very hard to reach these small scale business partners. Of course, difficulties in cross-regional collaboration. Sorry, is there a question? Okay, I'll continue. So difficulties in cross-regional collaboration can also be tricky and off-putting for the universities. Again, example from Lincoln, they wanted to do a project with the University of East Anglia, and they were really interested, and they had the same vision about the content and the relevance, but it was just the guidelines of the different operational programs that they didn't allow this kind of cooperation between regions. And next challenge is the university organizational culture, and this is a broader issue related to the engagement of the university. It can be complicated to combine any kind of engagement activities to the so-called academic core. So the whole role of the third mission remains a bit vague. And if we talk about structural funds, there can be a mismatch between the academic profiles of these universities and the regional needs. So they don't always meet, and then it's very hard to try and build meaningful RDI projects. It is quite often that there is a lack of resources towards the third mission, and also absence of institutional strategies for the engagement. As in, for example, in the case of Aveiro, which is very connected and does a lot of work with different regional actors, they didn't have an institutional strategy for the third mission at all. And again, if we look at the structural funds projects, they have different set of indicators, and then universities are looking different kind of outputs. So kind of bringing these two together can be very, very tricky. So often there is a lack of academic outputs, and that's why, again, universities are less motivated. And this was also quite clear in my Finnish case study, as there have been many changes in the Finnish higher education landscape in the past 10 years. And universities are state funded, and nowadays their state funding depends on certain indicators. So these performance indicators are entirely bound to publications and degrees. So there's no room for any other kind of indicators. So again, universities feel that this is marginal activity for them. And I kind of like this picture. I chose it because I think it illustrates very well that it's important to find balance between different actors and different tasks, or otherwise things might fall apart. Then the third challenge is not surprising at all. It has to do with structural funds administrative procedures. So the literature review revealed that policy goals can be unrealistic, and when it comes to implementation of the operational programs, there is a high level of bureaucracy. And some universities even consider structural funds to be a very high risk form of funding. And also my case universities, I'm not going to go into detail in this, but they had experienced clawbacks, and they had received different guidelines from different funding authorities, and that's complicated when you have so many different managing authorities. As in Finland, it was supposed to be very, very simple in this program period, but there are still up to 10 or even more different funding authorities. So if one of these authorities follow these guidelines, the other one might choose to follow, make another interpretation, and this might have a significant impact on the eligibility of the costs. And one of my informants, who was a high-level research and enterprise, very experienced director, said that structural funds, they are just a very, very complicated way of lending money for universities. So this isn't something that actually increases motivation to go for these funding schemes. And of course, match funding rates, that's also a thing to consider. In my case, universities, I think in Portugal, the funding rate, they were much higher compared to the UK. In Lincolnshire, it was for ERDF funds 60%. And in Finland, it depends on the funding authority again. But for ERDF, it's usually about 70% and even higher for European social funds. So it can be complicated, especially in Finland. Even though the funding rates were better than in the UK, the management thought that it's still investing the university funds for something that when there's no gain when it comes to the state funding. When it doesn't count as a research funds, there was no point to go and no point to invest university's own money. And the final challenge was related to the structural funds projects outputs, which can be very overestimated. So most of my informants agreed that you just have to promise a lot these days to receive funds. As I already mentioned, the lack of alignment with structural funds indicators and academic outputs can be problematic. But here I must say that in my Portuguese case, it was very interesting that there were joint calls with structural funds calls with the National Science Foundation when they funded basic research based on regional priorities. So they could actually just do research with in structural funds projects. So that was one way to go around that. Most of the also my informants, as the literature says here too, there is usually a low number of commercial results, and especially in case of Finland, this was clear. And my informants really agreed and said that this has mainly to do with the national adaptations of the structural funds guidelines that actually hinders generating any commercial results. But I'll come back to that later. So then I'm going to talk a little bit about each case study. Liliana, tell me when to stop. I still have quite many slides to go.
Okay. Well, maybe in between 7 minutes.
Okay. Let's try to do that then. Okay. Few words about my case study. So first, University Consortium of Pori, which was the odd one of the cases, because it's not a one university but a network of universities. And at a time of the first research interviews, it was a partnership of 4 Finnish universities located in more urban and central areas. But since in 3 years' time, nowadays, it's a partnership of 2 Finnish universities. But let's not go into that. So in the Satakunta region, there's been university activity since late 80s. The former Tampere University of Technology started training engineers when Nokia was in terrible need of engineers, and the bigger universities couldn't produce enough engineers for Nokia, so they started training them in more remote areas too. But the University Consortium of Pori was established in its current form in 2003, but it's still quite small university campus, 2,500 students, but it has a very strong regional focus. And they do offer multidisciplinary study programs, and they are very active in structural funds. And curiously, they are quite heavily subsidized by the city of Pori. There are 6 such university consortia in Finland. So Pori is the one that gets most funding from the city too. Case 2, University of Lincoln in north of England, quite close to the coastline. A historic city of Lincoln is the headquarters of Lincolnshire, which is mostly known for agriculture, and it's the biggest producer of vegetables in the UK. University of Lincoln was established in 1996, first as a branch campus, but then it grew into a full-range university, and now it's a multidisciplinary university with 14,000 students. And they have 3 campuses, one in Lincoln, one in Riceholm, which is about 3-4 miles from the city of Lincoln, and Holbeach, which is in a very rural agricultural area. And they have a national center for food manufacturing there. And then finally, University of Aveiro in northern Portugal, again, a remote peripheral region. But the university has a strong connection to its region, and there are 3 universities within that region, but the University of Aveiro is the one that is most involved with regional development. It's a quite big one, 17,000 students, and currently it's very involved in regional innovation policies, and they have a lot of structural funds projects. So findings, to summarize, all my case universities thought that universities are important for regional development, and structural funds programs are important source of funding, especially for more remote, in more remote regions. One of my informants from the University Consortium of Pori, representing one of the parent universities located in more central areas, said that structural funds are the more important for universities the further you go from central areas. And all organizations agreed that structural funds, they support universities' regional engagement, and they contribute to RDI activities, although informants from Pori were a bit more skeptical about the actual impact and alignment of these activities together. Then about collaboration, only Lincoln thought that there should be more regional coordination, and there is competition. Even though the University of Lincoln is very, very connected to local authorities, and they collaborate a lot with Lincoln County Council and Lincolnshire County, so still they thought that they would need more coordination activities to make better use of the structural funds. Not curiously, all informants agreed that structural funds are bureaucratic, and there is a need to simplify the bidding processes and the reporting processes, and also eligibility criteria of partner organizations. The match funding rate divided opinions depending on the national adaptation and the national funding rate. So Lincoln and Aveiro thought that structural funds projects are not actually quite easy to combine with education and research activities. Whereas my case from Finland, they thought that yes, there are complications there, and they again said that this has mainly to do with the structural funds national adaptation of the operational programs and the guidelines that restricts these kind of activities. I think I'm running out of time, but I'm just going to concentrate on few points here. Considering the outcomes, all universities agree that you have to promise a lot to get the funds, maybe even too much, and that the number of commercial outcomes can be low, especially in Finland, when again this is restricted by the national adaptation of the guidelines. In Lincoln and Aveiro, the case was quite different. So to summarize, the strict structural funds guidelines, they are to blame here. They can complicate delivering structural funds activities successfully, and this has to do with all the challenges. In my case, universities, the structural funds projects, they were not very strategically planned or managed, and they remained as quite marginal activity. But however, they were strongly associated with the third mission. Especially in the case of Pori, there was very little institutional interest in the top management to engage with these funding instruments, unless they were able to generate academic results, like in the case of Aveiro, when there were joint calls with the Science Foundation, or when there are very large-scale funding available to promote key research areas. And this was done in Lincoln and Aveiro, where the top management were involved in project designing of the projects. So the case was very different in Pori, where individual academics wanted to engage with the region and deliver these projects. So I'm sure I promised to talk about the typology of the different types of university-led structural funds projects. So I'm going to through this slide. So in my 4 cases, I managed to identify 4 different types of university-led structural funds projects. And the first one is top-down institutional structural funds projects. And this is something I saw in Lincoln and also in Aveiro. They are large-scale in strategic initiatives, and they do build on regional priorities. But as they are designed by the university management, sometimes it can be difficult to connect and find the right academics to work with the businesses. In these projects, a university can act as an intermediary between businesses and the funding. For example, when the SMEs lack the resources or capacity skills to bid for these instruments, the university can step in and then offer consultancy or contract research or innovation vouchers or whatever and manage the funds. Then there are academic-led structural funds projects, and they do vary in scale and scope, and this is something I saw in Aveiro and Pori. They can be based on both fundamental or applied research, and the ERDF ones are more concentrated on business partnerships, whereas the European Social Funds projects, they are more concentrated on public service, educational mission, and this is something that was especially in Pori. Then there are professional-led structural funds projects, so non-academic-led projects, concentrating on capacity building. In Aveiro, especially focused on internationalization or IEP, or and then in the case of Pori, there were many educational projects, for example, creating content and modules for continuous education, for example, in maritime studies. And finally, this is a curiosity from Lincoln, outsourced structural fund activities. which are small scale activities that can provide the needed knowledge or equipment for local stakeholders that actually run the project. So, for example, in Lincoln, when the county council started to run technology hubs, which were structural funds funded, they lacked the skills and capacity to use the equipment, so they outsourced part of that part to the university, which used to run 3 of those hubs, but now there's only 1 left. And also, based on the different dimensions of the 3rd mission I presented before, it was quite clear that there are ways to align all these different types of structural funds projects together with the 3rd mission, sometimes successfully. And now I'm sure I'm running out of time. Oh yes, big time. So here I'm sure I can share the presentation with you, and there is some related publications if you want to know more. And of course, I'm here to respond to any questions if you have questions. So thank you. We're going to stop here.
Thank you, Maria. That was a very interesting presentation, and especially something that is, as you said, quite new and needs to really be explored, because there's so many funding is so needed for universities that right now it's good to understand how universities actually relate to it and how they can take more advantage of it, especially universities and regions like rural regions, as you said. So does anyone have any questions at the moment? You can also write it in the chat. Yeah.
I noticed there's something in the chat, but it's just you telling me to stop.
John, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Maria. I thought that was really interesting. It's a pity I had to jump over the last slides, because I thought it's when it was getting juicy. Particularly, you're finding that university managements are not really interested unless it involves academic outputs. Or I think the other point was that it doesn't, or it provides key funding, a large amount of funding for key areas, research areas that are of interest in the university. And I thought that's interesting in the sense that we hear, certainly in the UK, but I think there's a message also that's come from other webinars in this series, that universities are trying to make themselves more societally relevant and particularly regionally more engaged. And that seems to run counter to what you've been finding. Now, you're talking specifically about structural funds related projects, of course, which are particularly complex and have to be designed in a certain way, as you said. And this may be in your final slides that you had to skip over, but I'd be interested in the strategies that you were recommending for universities, either for structural funds managing authorities to try and get better engagement for among universities for the funding, or among academics to try and get their university managements to take this more seriously and see it more positively.
Okay, there are a lot of recommendations, and one of the things I jumped over is the fact that one of my key findings, which I thought is very important, is that despite the lack of interest on the management level, individual academics finds this very meaningful and want to do the engagement work, even though there is no support mechanisms in place, which is good. So researchers feel that they want to engage also through these funding instruments. But in the recommendations, I have more tailored approach for different stakeholders. So in each structural funds operational programs I looked at, universities are expected to do a number of things, but then the indicators are the same for each and every action. So it's universities' interests are not presented in any way. So maybe integrating the way that the Portuguese case, that was great that they had the joint calls with the National Science Foundation. So just bringing two different aspects together might be beneficial, just keeping the same indicators, but then kind of building up on that and bringing the science, like research funding on top of that, and creating synergies between would be good. And then I propose training academics about the funding opportunities. They might lack knowledge on what can be done with these funding instruments. Those who have not been involved, they tend not to be very aware of the possibilities. And on the management level, that's curious. Especially in the Finnish case, they were very skeptical, but all the 4 parent universities of the University Consortium of Pori at a time, they had strategies for engagement, and they all kind of had the whole documentation about how it's important and how the third mission should be in the core of university activities. But none of these strategies acknowledged that they have rural campuses, that they have presence in these university consortia where there's a specific regional role. So that should be more taken into account in the institutional strategies too, that they have regional responsibility to work with those stakeholders. And that might be something very different compared to the urban areas. I hope I responded your many questions.
Okay, thanks, Maria. Thank you.
Maria, could I ask a question? It's Linda Stewart here. Sorry, my connectivity is not very good today, so I hope you can hear me okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I found that a really interesting presentation. I've been involved directly in this area through the University of the Highlands and Islands in the north of Scotland for the last 4 programming periods. And the experience is very, very similar, particularly when you're talking about the challenges. I wanted to just quickly pick up on a couple of points relating to what you said about the administrative procedures and the outputs. Our experience is we found it was essential to engage in the strategic development and monitoring of programs as they go through their delivery. So the university is actually able to contribute more comprehensively to any delivery. I know it depends very, very much on the different national and regional context, but were any of your 3 case study universities able to engage in this way at the very start?
Unfortunately not. That's not the message that got through from my 3 cases. But I do believe that approach would be very beneficial for all parties.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Sorry, Linda.
Does anyone have any other questions? Of course, we will send the PowerPoint also to the attendees, so to make sure that they have all the sources that you.
And the full thesis will be online too very soon. So maybe Liliana, you can share the link.
Yeah, we'll do so. Did you want to say anything, John?
Yeah, unless anybody's got any questions, I just wanted to come back on what you were saying, and also ask a question which I posed previously to one of our other speakers, and which has come up quite a lot in university level discussions among heads of faculty and heads of department, and that's the incentive systems that there are to encourage academics to get involved in these projects. And that, you made the point of lack of information, which I think is very true. And there's quite a lot that is done and can be done. but there is the question of how the incentive structures are set up to encourage academics to do things that are more engaged, that involve regional outreach and participation and partnerships, because the indicators that are used for the metrics that are used for advancement are typically related to research outputs, particularly in peer-reviewed journals. They're related to income generation, particularly from maybe from prestigious bodies like the European Research Council or national research councils. They're related to maybe teaching assessments. And then, of course, you have certain things which come under, probably varies by university, knowledge exchange, external engagement, citizenship, that are typically secondary indicators for advancement. So you have to be good at, if you like, in inverted commas, or excellent in these other metrics. And I'm just wondering whether in the 3 universities, in terms of that you've been looking at, whether you saw any incentive structures.
Not many, but some.
Okay,
so,
good.
for example, Tampere University, the former one, there's been mergers. They gave a prize of €5,000 for the best engagement activity of the year. And that became an annual thing, I think 7 years ago. And also University of Turku, they started creating their own set of indicators for, not for the state funding, that's quite straightforward, publications and so forth, but internal indicators for the engagement. So that was still in process when I interviewed the staff 2 years ago. But one of the key indicators was the amount of structural funds, because they automatically thought that that's engagement activity. So they were creating these internal incentives to motivate academics to engage more, and that was among those indicators.
Okay, that's interesting. Irene, I think you'd sweep up if that was an indicator here. Okay, thanks Maria.
I have a question too. Thank you for the presentation. Did you observe any differences in kinds of universities, in faculties, and also in
yes.
engagement?
Mm-hmm. So these all universities, they were multidisciplinary, and of course there are disciplinary differences. So for example, the very hardcore life sciences, I remember in the case of Aveiro, they were struggling to find business partners, and they would have wanted to work with the industry, but there weren't any suitable partners within that area, so they just couldn't. So there are a lot of differences. In the University Consortium of Pori, it was the economics that was the most engaged with the regional authorities and businesses, but they also had technology there. They also had arts and culture and social sciences, and they all had found a way to connect with different regional stakeholders. So I would say there are differences, but it's mostly in the target groups who they can collaborate with. So it was quite clear that the business people, they worked with businesses, and technology people, they worked with businesses, and social scientists with healthcare sector. But I think that was the richness and the beauty of the successful collaboration, that you just have to find the right partners to work with, and that's not always possible through the structural funds instruments. Also, I've been told in the past 3 years.
Thanks.
So, thank you.
Okay, so if is there any more questions in the audience? If not, then maybe we should end the webinar here to give people also some time if they have a meeting afterwards.
Yes, I have a meeting in Kenya, so
wow.
Wow, it's very
I'm going to
exciting
fly
day
over
for
in
me.
2 minutes. Okay, well, thank you so much, Maria, and thank you to everyone for your interest in today's webinar. Our next webinar will take place next week, not next week, in 2 weeks, on Wednesday, December 16th, when Dr. Alexandra Polido will present on sustainable development discourse and smart specialization strategies. So please use the same contact email to register for this next webinar as well. And we hope to see you again soon in future events. So thank you again, and I hope you have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.